Good afternoon. My name is Nilsen, and I research can the direction of the association between social media use and depression be determined among adolescents? Now, in the average classroom of 25 students, statistically 5 of those students will seriously consider suicide this year. In addition, statistically 2 of those students will either attempt suicide or purposely harm themselves. Now, suicide has become the 3rd leading cause of death in adolescents, with 90% of them having some mental health disorder, and a majority of them having some form of depression. Now, depression has become a big topic of conversation recently because it's been increasing in both adolescents and young adults. However, there have not been many studies focusing specifically on adolescents, and thus I focused my research on adolescents. Now, higher depressive rates have been associated with higher social media use. However, there's been no direction in this. In addition, I focus on researching 2 types of behaviors involved in social media, that being comparison and social interaction. And overall, I have found that the more time that adolescents spent on certain types of social media led to the more they engaged in certain types of behaviors, which led to an increased risk of depression. Now, what is depression? Depression is a general loss of interest in one's daily activities for at least a period of 2 weeks. In addition, they must also meet other symptoms such as change in sleep or diet, feelings of worthlessness, and of course, thoughts of suicide or suicidal actions. Now, depression has been on the rise recently. Between 2005 and 2015, depression rates in young adults have increased from 8.8% to 9.7%. And in adolescents, it's increased from 8.7%, which, mind you, was comparable to young adults in 2005, to an astonishing 11.3% in 2015, which thus is not comparable to young adults anymore, and thus adolescent depression rates are increasing at a much faster rate than young adults. Social media use has also increased in the same time period, increasing from 12% to 90% in young adults, and by 2016, adolescent depression rates adolescent social media use, was at 94%. Now, what kind of social media do people use? We can see here. Obviously, young adults favor Facebook, with nearly 90% of young adults having a Facebook account. On the other hand, adolescents favor Snapchat and Instagram. Now, you might say, wait a second, adolescent use in Facebook is also extremely high. Now, this is true. However, studies have shown that adolescent use in Facebook is actually declining because they actually favor Snapchat and Instagram. As I was saying before, there are 2 major types of behaviors that I looked at involving social media. That being comparison, which is comparing yourself to other people on social media. That is, whether you think someone else's life is better than yours, or you think someone's life is worse than yours based on what you see on social media. Now, this will be considered a characteristic of Facebook and Instagram, and while not being considered a major characteristic of Snapchat because it's not emphasized that much in Snapchat. On the other hand, the other major behavior that I looked at is social interaction, which is messaging other people, having conversations with other people, and in general, expanding your social circles on social media. This will be considered a characteristic of Facebook and Snapchat, while not being a big characteristic of Instagram, because it's also not heavily emphasized in Instagram. Now, several studies have correlated higher social media use with higher depressive rates in both adolescents and young adults. However, none of these studies could determine why there was this association, or what was the cause or direction of this association. And thus the question still remains, can this direction or cause of this association be determined? And what I focused my research on. Now I researched this by using a causal comparative methodology. I did so because I was looking for the actual cause of the association between social media use and depression. And this methodology allowed me to do this. Also, since I'll use mainly qualitative data and not quantitative data, meaning that most of my data had almost no numbers in it whatsoever, this methodology allowed me to do this. Lastly, my data was mainly previous studies, and this methodology allowed me to use previous studies to synthesize a conclusion. For my procedures, so I found the previous articles by using PubMed, which is a great data mining resource because it gives access to millions upon millions of articles for free. I also ensured that all these articles were isolated from each other in order to make sure I was not duplicating data, so that I did not have any duplicated data, and it was all from different studies. Lastly, I ensured that I used only post-2013 articles. This is because, as you can see here, the DSM-5, or Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, was published in 2013. And this book is the latest classification of depression. Thus, anything written prior to 2013 may have inaccurate information. Thus, I need to make sure I do not use any. After I collected all this data, these sources, I inputted all this information into a data table that I created in order to keep the information comprehensible, since this is such a complex topic. I then analyzed the data in order to form a conclusion. Now my results were pretty interesting. I found that young adults who use Facebook, when looking at them, the more time that they spent on Facebook led to an increase in comparisons that they made in Facebook with their peers. And this led to a higher chance of developing depressive symptoms and thus developing depression. However, young adults who use Facebook for social reasons, actually saw lower depressive symptoms because they used it for social reasons. However, when looking at Instagram and comparing adolescents and young adults, it was determined that adolescents actually make more comparisons in a given amount of time with their peers compared to young adults. And using all this information, I synthesized a conclusion that adolescents who spend more time in Instagram will make more comparisons, and thus the higher risk they will develop depression. However, if adolescents used Snapchat, they used it for social interactions, which is, as I said before, social interactions is a characteristic of Snapchat. And thus, if they use Snapchat, they would have a lower risk of developing depression or have depressive symptoms. Now the implications of my research is pretty big. The main point of it would be to spread awareness. The point to spread awareness is to spread awareness of the behaviors on social media. Because obviously, adolescents are not using Instagram properly or are spending too much time on Instagram. And it's having negative impacts on them. Thus, if awareness can be spread, then solutions could be in place in order to mitigate either the amount of time adolescents spend on Instagram or their behaviors on Instagram. And if this is done, then it could possibly decrease the amount of depressive symptoms they have, which could then decrease the amount of the depressive rates in adolescents, which could thus decrease suicide rates in adolescents. However, it is also important to promote further research in this topic of social media use and depression. This is because it will help to validate these results and to expand upon it with further research.
Thank you, Nick.
How did you evaluate the sources you collected to make sure that they would be credible, valid, and reliable? And which sources did you discard and why?
Okay, that's a great question. So in order to check the credibility of them, I ensured that I checked the credentials of each author in each article, and ensured that each article was from a peer-reviewed journal. And repeat the last part of the question?
Sure. And the second part was, which sources did you discard and why?
I discarded several sources that were written prior to 2013. Because as I said before, the DSM-5 was written in 2013 and is the latest classification of depression. So the studies that I had, the sources I had prior to 2013 could have had inaccurate information. And thus I decided not to discard them.
Okay, thanks.
Which of the various perspectives you explored was the most difficult for you to incorporate into your research inquiry, and why?
The most difficult one to take into consideration is the discrepancy between depression and depressive symptoms. Because most of the sources that I used simply looked at depressive symptoms seen in adolescents and young adults, while on the other hand, I was looking for actual depression. So in order to account for that, I had to make the assertion that the more amount of depressive symptoms that someone has, the greater likelihood they are to develop depression.
Which of your sources was the most influential, and in what way is that influence apparent in your conclusion?
The most influential study that I had was by Tanda, and this is the most influential because he asserted that adolescents who use Facebook, the more time they spent on it, it led to them making more comparisons, and that leading to greater depressive rates. And he also asserted that young adults who use Facebook for social reasons actually had a lower chance of developing depression. And thus I used this was a major part of my research because I applied this to adolescents and their use of in Instagram and Snapchat.
Good, thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you very much.